Good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome Mr. Nilsson from the University College London. Thank you for being here with us today. ICAR is currently conducting a series of interviews with leading experts in order to improve our understanding of the current situation in Ukraine and Russia. So, Mr. Nilsson, you're a Danish expert in Eastern Europe and security who works at the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies.
That's absolutely right. Yes, where of course our field, as the name implies, is precisely this region.
Okay, so I would like to ask you a few questions. We've recently seen a new level of tension since the Russian government has officially recognized the separatist territories in eastern Ukraine. How do you think will the UK react, and which impact will these measures have?
Well, I mean, we can look at what the UK has done so far, which has not been enormously impressive. Talking about, as to be fair, a lot of countries have done, talking about acquisition of sanctions, so some sanctions now, more later. I mean, if you know anything about the UK financial sector, you know there's been a problem for quite a few years with, let's say, not necessarily dodgy money, but certainly problems with finding out precisely where all the wealth being invested in the financial sector in London comes from, its provenance. And although, of course, some of the sanctions being suggested now by the UK do make sense, then there's a much bigger root and branch work needed. And this is not just a matter of Russia, by the way. I mean, we've seen previously, say, with Azerbaijani funds and funds from all over the world. And it didn't look to me as if the British government is looking to have that root and branch survey of wealth in its coffers, so to speak. If we look beyond that, I mean, the big thing the UK could do in this context, in terms of sanctions, would be in terms of finance and the financial sector. Beyond that, the UK doesn't really have the same clout as the EU or the US. I mean, if you look, for instance, apologies, Lucas, I know you asked specifically about the UK, but if we just compare quickly to what the Germans did very recently, you know, when Scholz said that, Olaf Scholz said that Nord Stream 2 will effectively be scuppered now. That's obviously quite a big rabbit to be able to pull out of the hat. And this is simply not something the UK has in its locker outside possibly the financial sector. The US, of course, is a completely different ballgame as well. So I think the UK did have a chance to take part in sanctions here. It doesn't look particularly coherent either in measures or in rhetoric coming out from the government, precisely how and or when sanctions will be scaled up. So right now it looks a little bit like a damn squib, but we will have to see in the coming days. Also, I do have to say, in fairness, there may well be some coordination of sanctions going on between, say, Britain, the EU, and the US, that they keep behind the scenes for now. So it may be more thought through than it looks to me.
Yes, this would have been actually my second question, to compare the stance of the UK to the European Union, because the UK government seems to be probably more determined at the moment than Germany or maybe other actors in the EU. Or what is your opinion?
Well, I'm not necessarily sure I would say they were more determined. I mean, the EU has the old problem that you've got now, after Britain left, 27 countries that have to agree on stuff. And if you really want to have long-ranging sanctions, you need to get everybody on board. And as we know, there are some countries in the EU, I'm particularly thinking, for instance, about Hungary, who have previously shown some sympathy for some policies in Russia. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that Hungary is saying that I certainly haven't seen anything to that effect, that Hungary is in favor of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, nothing like that. But if we're talking about serious sanctions here, if we're talking about turning the EU's energy profile away from Russia in the medium to long term, which is really what would have to be necessary, then you need a level of unity that the EU will take a little bit of time to get in place. I also think, if I can be a little bit critical towards the EU, they did have about 3 or 4 months already where they could have gotten their ducks in a row, as you say. They could have made their preparations of coordination slightly better. Having said that, I do really think it's a massive step that Olaf Scholz was out and effectively scopering Nord Stream 2. I think that was a big one. Possibly, as some commentators have said, it even surprised Russian elites. You also have some member states. I noticed, for instance, today, Poland and Lithuania talking about, well, all of this should really speed up Ukraine's EU membership. Now, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon necessarily, but it is quite an important signal to send. And if, for instance, you look at the Baltic member states of the EU, they have been very consistent and consistently pushing for a very firm line against Russian aggression in this and other cases. So I'm not sure I completely agree with you that the UK has taken a firmer line. I mean, it looks to me more rhetoric than anything right now. I think in order to see how, what can I say, how effective the financial sanctions will be and the individual sanctions, we may have to give it a little bit of time. But I mean, just to take one example, there certainly seemed to be, if I understand the news correct, some confusion about who was actually covered by the sanctions. And that's not enormously helpful when you're trying to send out the message. So yeah, that's what I'm looking at right now.
Well, thank you very much. I have read that you have previously advised the Danish Ministry of Defense. Would you say there is a particular Danish perspective on the crisis in Ukraine?
So very quickly, just so I'm absolutely clear about that, what I have done was I wrote a report within the University of Copenhagen, which had been commissioned by the Ministry of Defense. So in that sense, but that's a public report. Otherwise, I haven't worked for the Ministry of Defense as such, just so we don't get them coming and complaining about me claiming anything like that. I wrote a report for them. The Danish perspective, again, I mean, if you're looking at the Danish Secretary of Defense, just changed, but both the previous and the current, or the Secretary for Foreign Affairs, they do seem to be fairly, I mean, certainly rhetorically, they're very clear that they oppose this. They're very clear that I mean, there was a lot of misgivings about Nord Stream, for instance, as well, Nord Stream 2 rather, as well. It should be said, though, by itself, of course, a country the size of Denmark, it is relatively limited what we can do in terms of, sanctions on our own or anything like that. But I think it's fair to say that Denmark is among the countries in the EU which show some willingness to go for relatively tough sanctions on Russia in this case. A lot is going on behind the scenes, so I can't say precisely where the dividing lines are between EU countries there, but it does, from everything I'm hearing rhetorically, the Danish government would be willing to push, for instance, for more sectoral bans or sectoral sanctions within Russia. Again, I think we need to give it a little bit more time. Basically, right now, if I can just expand on that quickly, we've got three possibilities, don't we? One, the Russian forces stay within the separatist regions as they are now, in which case there will be a lot of anger, maybe a bit more sanctions, but as it looks right now, probably not the full set of sanctions, say, for instance, beginning to look at SWIFT and so on from the Americans. Second, you can have Russian troops trying to take over more of eastern Ukraine, as has been mused. And third, of course, you can have an all-out attack within Ukraine. The third is probably not enormously likely, I'm hoping. The second is a possibility, and if that happened, I think you would very, very quickly find out where Denmark and every other EU country stood, and Britain. Because if at that point you're not ready to come out with the very big sanctions, then I think you can assume that it's not going to happen.
Well, since the current situation is, of course, a major event that is as well affecting the security framework in Europe, so I would like to ask you, how do you think will this conflict strengthen or weaken the perspective of developing an independent EU defense system, taking into account the role of NATO as well?
That is an extremely good question. I think the big factor influencing this remains as it was before, that the US is slowly pulling away from Europe. I mean, it may be pulling away more slowly now because of a Russian threat, perceived and real. But in the longer term, if you're looking at American rhetoric, foreign policy rhetoric, military rhetoric, there's a lot focused on China more and more also focused on internal requirements, internal squabbles, so on and so forth. That's the big thing that will have an influence on the European security landscape if we're looking medium to long term, as far as I can see. But of course, right now, with, you've got a permanent member of the UN Security Council with a lot of nuclear weapons, which has, for the second time in 8 years, conducted direct aggression against another UN member state inside Europe. So right now, obviously, all EU states, European NATO states, together with the US and Canada, will be joining up fairly closely for the foreseeable future. It probably also will mean that, if you recall, under Trump, but also under Obama and under Biden as well, for that matter, you have had this constant rhetoric that European countries should do more in NATO, contribute more and so on, in terms of military expenditure by GDP. That sort of niggling dispute, I think, will probably be put on the back burner, certainly for as long. I mean, Biden has already been more diplomatic about it, but it'll also be put on the back burner while this crisis is ongoing, and that could well last for a while. I find it difficult to see how anybody in NATO can feel perfectly comfortable with Russia in Europe as long as the current regime sits there, which of course it can do for quite a while. So as long as that's the case, I think the Europeans, and a separate European security community outside the US probably won't develop fully, because the Americans will want to stay in, and obviously the Europeans will want them to. Once that abates, I still see in the medium to long term the US pulling more away from Europe than it is now. And then, of course, France might have ambitions for a European initiative, for instance, for security, as they've had before.
Thank you. So I would like to ask you one last question. Mr. Nilsson, you have done extensive research on the Russian perception of Ukrainian and Belarusian sovereignty. Do you think that this perception is currently changing in the light of Mr. Putin's recent speech, for example?
Again, very good question. I puff my cheeks because it's difficult to answer. What I will say, though, is when he refers, for instance, as he did in the speech now, and I don't know, you may well be familiar with his article from last summer, where of course, a lot of the same themes sort of propped up.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. When Putin and people around him refers to essentially the illegitimacy of Ukrainian statehood, as opposed to the apparent legitimacy of Russian statehood, then that does build into quite a longer tradition. I mean, this is something I've heard from some members of the Russian elites, more than 10 years ago, or you could hear it back in the 90s as well, but it started coming up again in the late 2000s. I think that it does seem to me reasonably clear that Vladimir Putin and people around him are increasingly focused on the idea of Russian identity as empire, and the idea of Russian civilization. You could do that and not annex anything. I'm not saying it was inevitable that Russia would become militarily aggressive, but certainly this focus on centering governance around Moscow, not just for people within the Russian Federation, but also for people in neighboring countries, notably Belarus and Ukraine. That tendency has been there for a while. The difference is, of course, before you had more of, you allowed more local agencies, so Belarusians, Ukrainians could push someone back, and you were willing to, from the Russian side, how can I put it? You were willing to accept, it seemed, that what we were dealing with was a community of, a community of mutual interest, and maybe, at most, a Russian desire to have suzerainty, but not sovereignty over the country, so deciding their foreign policies, but not necessarily their domestic policies. But of course, what we've seen, after the presidential election in Belarus in 2020, and after, pressure against Ukraine wasn't leading Russia anywhere, we have seen an increasing interest in some circles in Russia, including Mr. Putin, of trying to take sovereignty in these two countries as well to some extent. Now, I don't think it's a done deal yet, not even for Belarus, but it does seem to be earlier tendencies now reinforced, really. And that, of course, also leads up to, if I may, look at this thing that from the beginning of the current crisis, if we go back, say, 3 or 4 months, Russia very, very quickly, and by Russia, I mean the regime here, painted itself into a corner. It very quickly put itself in with very strong demands and very sort of rigid demands of NATO and indeed of Ukraine, demands which were not going to be followed. And now they're in a bit of a fix, because if they were simply, if Russia was simply to allow this to peter out, pull away troops and all that, it might look, even with the recognition of East Ukrainian independence, it might still look a bit as if Russia had been scared away, and Putin can't do that. So this is why I'm still, Lucas, a little bit concerned that the tendencies we've seen before in the sort of disregard for the legitimacy of, say, Ukrainian independence, they may be further reinforced, and it may unfortunately be that more military, let's say, activity will take place in order to reinforce it. We'll have to see. I am guessing, and it may be it peters out, but the events of the last few days have certainly been very disturbing.
Thank you very much for sharing your point of view today with us, and a lot of interesting insights.
Thank you.